Hello, this is Michael Smith, and this is lecture 3 for week 1 of Anthropology 400 for Valley College. And it's my pleasure to be able to talk to you today about language and communication as a part of the anthropological structure of humankind, if you will. That's a mouthful of words, but basically, we are the only organism on the planet that has the natural ability to talk or speak a language, write a language, communicate in a language. There are other organisms that speak. We think of certain birds, and we think of some of the skills developed even by the chimpanzee, not to speak necessarily, but they carry on human type communications. And so as we begin to talk about that today, we realize that language is probably one of our greatest skills. The ability to communicate firmly rests upon our biological makeup. We are programmed for language, if you would, be it through sounds or gestures. We have things like sign language, like the American Sign Language, are fully developed languages that we use to communicate with people that don't have the same skills. Maybe they're deaf or other areas of problems that we are able to communicate yet with sign language. Cries of babies are considered to be a language which is not much learned, and it we talk about the different aspects of that, but babies do cry. Symbolic sounds, gestures, those kind of things are all important. So when you think about a language, it is a means of communications in which we develop symbols that represent certain sounds, and of course then we learn those, we can communicate with each other. Native Americans did not have a written language until sometime in the 1800s. I think the Cherokee were the first to ever develop a written language. It's a fairly easy, simple language to learn, but it became very important to them, and they began soon to publish a Cherokee language newspaper. People began to read it. So that was a great instance of a language that was spoken for hundreds of years, no doubt, but was never written down or never codified. And so the ability to write, which comes out of that need, is important. Of course, it made great changes in Western civilization when we invented movable type in the 1500s. And with everything had been hand copied for that first 1500 years. And then suddenly we print over 5 million documents in the next 50 years. Most of that was religious stuff, but it was important that we're able to move forward to communicate, to give some kind of indication of how we can. And you can imagine what that did to cultural advances, because living together is vital if you can communicate. If you can't communicate, it puts both sides at a disadvantage. We live in a world that's in America today that's pretty much bilingual. We learn some Spanish, other people learn some English. We're able to communicate, people are able to hold a job. But if that were not possible, then it would be like the famed Tower of Babel in the Bible, where it just turned into a Babel, if you would, and nobody understood anything, and not able to build, and not able to erect, or not able to do or to grow. And so, the Bible says that that's how men scattered, because their language confusion caused them to be in total chaos. That's a prime example of an anthropological issue where people they just could not do anything or accomplish anything. So language is a vital element in our connections and in our abilities. And if you didn't have that, you would be at a distinct disadvantage. Linguistics is the study of how different people form their language, and that's vitally important as well. You go into tribes where their language has never been written down. There is a methodology that you would follow to listen to the sounds and to understand the meanings, and then from that you would have to develop an alphabet, and from the alphabet you develop words. Those are all a part of a linguistic understanding. That starts at the very lowest level of phonetics. If you have children in school, Many schools will start by teaching phonics or phonetics or phonology, listening or phonome, listening to the sound of a word, sounding it out helps you learn to read. And phonics is a huge advantage to children who learn to read. In fact, it may be one of the best ways in the world. Not every school uses phonics, but those listening to the sound, phono, we get our word phonograph, or phone, or telephone, which means you're able to listen and communicate, and that's of vital importance. And then we talk about morphology, the forming of words, a morpheme, the root of a word, and what that means, like phono again, which means sound or hear. We talk about syntax in a language, how you put words together to make sense. When I'm grading your papers for this course, you're going to get feedback from me in the margins on a sentence that you write, and sometimes I'll put out there, this sentence doesn't make sense. It's missing integral pieces. You don't have a subject and a verb. You don't have an article, or you use the wrong form of a verb. All those things go into talking about the syntax of a language, and all of that makes up what we call grammar. When you study grammar, you are studying how your language operates. If it's English, it's important, or Spanish, that you understand not just a bunch of words, but how you put those words together to communicate, to make sense, to help others to understand. Languages are considered to be in what they call a language family. And of course, most European languages belong to the same family. German, English, French, all of those languages, Spanish, Portuguese, all of these fit together in one language family, because that means you can see similarities between words, and you're able to understand based on that family of languages. If you went to the Asian parts of the world, you'll see there's a family of languages there. Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Thai, all those languages would belong to a different family than the English would. And so we understand we're able to translate, which means you take something from one language to another. There is not a simple one-on-one most times. Many times you have to translate ideas. Same thing with if you do sign language. You translate concepts and ideas, sometimes instead of word for word. It's funny when you deal with people in other languages, especially in Appalachia, we have all of these interesting sayings, like hit the road, which we mean to, get started, get going, or shake a leg means to speed up. My Filipino friends that they lived with me for a year, when you make a comment like that, there's no word for word translation. And they're looking at their foot, literally saying, what does shaking my foot have to do with speeding up, or all these other language things that are unique? And so you think about that, even when you're working in an office and you're in a position, say, of customer service or whatever, you respect other people's language and you respect other people's understanding. One of the cultural things that we run into these days is this idea of somebody from another culture or another language, that you look down upon them or you make comments about them or whatever. That's one of the great things that we need to work on, is respect for people that are different than ourselves. They come from different cultures. Their language to them is just as prized as English is to us. And so we should be very careful that we don't disparage someone because of their language skills. It's very difficult. English is one of the most difficult languages in the world to understand. Then even when you can speak it, it's difficult to write it because we have so many rules and things that go with that. So keep that in mind when you're dealing, especially in the public sphere, with people who come from different countries, who like different things than we do, that they have equally the same right to like all those things. There was a time when your ancestors came to this country and they spoke German or Irish or Italian, and they were persecuted and looked down upon because of the country they came from. Just because we've been here and we can do it doesn't give us the right to do the same thing. That is a anthropological consideration. So linguistics diverge over time. We probably all started with a central language somewhere in our history, and one group developed along a different line, settled in a different region. Their language will change in that region. So the Spanish developed from that central language into Spanish or into German or into English, Irish, still those things. One of the interesting things about this language change is recent studies they've done in Appalachia, that is from West Virginia down to northern South Carolina, that our language, because we were the more remote you are, the more true this was, that your language still carried elements of Old English, the 1611 King James Bible kind of English, or Shakespeare, that you still have in your language those words. I'll never forget the word fetch. That's an Old English word that you often heard in upstate South Carolina, fetch, which means to go and get something. Well, for the modern person, they probably have never heard the word and wouldn't understand it, but that was in 1611 a very big deal. Languages change over time, and the interesting thing is they can mean today, a word can mean today exactly opposite to what it meant in the past. For instance, in the King James Bible, it says, "He who now letteth will let till he be taken out of the way." The word let in 1611 meant to hinder or to prevent. Today, the word let means exactly the opposite. It means to allow something to move forward. So you see, you have to have a dictionary sometimes to understand what someone actually is meaning, but linguistics will diverge. There is such thing, and we see it every day in America, this thing of linguistic nationalism, that our language is the only language somebody should be speaking, that we have the best language, that because we are English speaking, it is the language of commerce in most of the world, and you can take English and go almost anywhere in the world and communicate on some level. But the attitude that this nativism, like, if you don't speak American, well, there's no such thing as speaking American. We have all kinds of different dialects. People in New Orleans have a French take to their language. People in South Carolina have a Southern take. My Filipino friend said, "You people in the South, you don't speak English, you speak something else." Well, it's hard for people to understand our accents and our use of language when they come from northern regions. It's very difficult sometimes. Or we go north, it's hard for us to realize that there is a great difference in language even within the country. So these linguistic ideas are tied to our society, they're tied to our culture, they're tied to our ethnicity. So all of these things are important considerations. And then there's such things as dialects. That's pretty much what we have in the U.S. The Southerners and Appalachians, we have a dialect of our own. We have words, and I'm often corrected. I have 9 degrees, and I'm often corrected for the way I say words. I don't make any apology for that. It's not something that you necessarily have to correct me on, because as I've often said, I was born a redneck, and I've tried to get over it in 62 years and have failed. But you will know the more fatigued I get at the end of the day, the more I slip back into my old language. Now, that's not something in a public job or a place you want to practice. You want to do your very best to speak the best English that you can and not let everybody know that you are a redneck, or if you are. But I do my best when I'm teaching to at least try to speak correctly. But the more tired I am, the more my past comes out. We also communicate by gestures, and those are important. And we have all kinds of tonal language, and we talk about, seeing facial features, which are great ways to communicate that we don't use words. So there's a lot of that you're going to be reading about this week in this chapter, and I think it's well worth your time. The other thing is that these things, then, as I've said, develop into an alphabet, develop into a writing system. But communications are the one thing we enjoy as human beings that that no other creature probably they don't have that we've found yet. They don't have the vocal cords. They don't have the things that we have in order to communicate. So as you read these chapters, pay careful attention to this. I think some of this will be very interesting to you, something that helps you understand human development and how we've come to be where we are. Thanks.